Going live.
Okay, so hi, my name is Sebastian Budin. I'm a founding member of Historical Materialism Journal and the book series and the conferences, some of which you will already be familiar with. So I want just to pitch to you the idea of you subscribing to the journal. Firstly, the journal comes out 4 times a year, published by Brill, over 1,000 pages of extremely important and stimulating Marxist theory and Marxist history. We have a discount at the moment for individual subscribers around the time of the London conference, and we very strongly both request and demand that you subscribe to the journal, that you get other people to subscribe to the journal, and of course that you get your institution, if you're part of a university or other institution, to subscribe to the journal. We need more subscribers for this project to be able to expand and continue. The second thing I really wanted to push was the book series. The book series you'll also probably be familiar with. It's published by Brill Academic Press, and then new volumes come out 12 months later with Haymarket Books in Chicago, paperbacks. We have more than 200 volumes published now, of translations, of original work, of document collections, of translations from Marxist theory from across the world, from Japan to China, to India, to Latin America, very important Latin American list shaping up in the book series, and so on. It's a really crucial intervention in Marxist literature and in making Marxist theory available that really hasn't existed on this scale since the 1970s. So we'd like you to look at the book series, buy individual volumes, perhaps take up the offer of the book club that Haymarket is promoting. And also, of course, again, if you're part of an institution, to get your institution to buy as many volumes as possible. Those are the 2 key elements of our activity, aside from the conferences, the journal and the book series. And we think it would be, it's essential, basically, for us, for our existence, for us to be able to continue to thrive, or those to expand. So please subscribe to the journal, buy the books in the book series, publicize both around you, and help us build the Historical Materialism project.
Welcome everyone. Thank you, Animated Seb, for that introduction. My name is Sai. I'll be chairing today's session on the class composition project. So I'll do 2 sort of introductions. I'll briefly introduce the panel, and then I'll introduce the project as well, before passing to our 2 other speakers. Just in terms of who we are. My name is Sai. Our 2 other speakers are Jamie Woodcock and Lorenza Monaco. All 3 of us are editors at Notes from Below, and Jamie and I are also editors at HM. And the way the session will work today is I will briefly introduce the class composition project, so you know where it came from, why we launched it, and what our hopes and dreams are for it. And I will then pass on to Lorenza, who will give you an overview of some of our initial findings, and particularly in terms of a questionnaire we've been using to get workers across the UK to sort of share information about their work, their political and practical challenges in the workplace, etc. And then Jamie will talk about some of the kind of long-form interviews we've been carrying out with some of the respondents as well. Hopefully that should give you a bit of a sense of what we've done so far. and there will then be plenty of time for you to ask questions, make comments, debate, disagree, no doubt in a deeply fraternal and constructive manner. So let's get started. So the project of the class composition project was launched in January this year. And the idea of it, as the title might indicate, is to make sense of class composition in Britain today. And to do so from the perspective of workers themselves. Our idea is that this is a long-term project. We hope to be able to publish sort of initial findings, some of which you will hear today around sort of a January period, but the idea is that it will be an ongoing project, and sessions like these are therefore also important for us to be able to kind of give a sense of what we've done so far and hear what comrades sort of make of it and be able to kind of critically engage with it and think about it. The project has its roots in a previous project that we carried out. Some of you might remember it from last year. We Notes from Below presented it at another HM online conference last year. The project was called From the Workplace. It came out in this, with my background, this is not going to work. If I stand behind it like this, it works. From the Workplace, like this, and it's a book that you can order for free on the Notes from Below website. You can also download the PDF. And From the Workplace was a first attempt to try to do this sort of broader analysis of the realities in the labor movement in Britain today. And because of COVID, the project ended up being slightly different. We'd hoped to kind of encourage the development of collective submissions. In the end, it ended up being a collection of 12 pieces of worker writings in different industries in Britain. We had teachers, teaching assistants. We had sort of different delivery workers, an Amazon warehouse worker, a chef, a supermarket security guard, etc. Others that you can go on the Notes from Below website to see. And all of those worked with editors of Notes from Below to sort of develop an analysis of their workplace, both in terms of the work itself, the makeup of the workplace, and the political challenges that they were facing. And a number of interesting themes emerged from that project, which were really about, on the one hand, the level of fragmentation that workers described in their workplace, and that was either about highly individualized work patterns, most obviously, for example, the kind of delivery workers, right, who work entirely on their own, but not only workers who sort of work on their own. So, for example, it was striking that the way in which the teaching assistants who were, in a school, highly sort of unionized workplace, etc., spoke about these kind of challenges in very similar ways. They also talked about the kind of isolation in the workplace, the fact that their work patterns were very different from permanent members of staff, and the kind of political problems that posed in terms of being able to organize, to integrate in the union, etc. Others, the Amazon warehouse worker, for example, talked about isolation because of the nature of work, right? That it was really a process of seeing workers very briefly on the bus to the so-called fulfillment center, and having extremely short breaks in which it was barely possible to sort of socialize with co-workers, and again, the kind of challenges that might raise. The second aspect that we found very striking in the From the Workplace project was the high levels of surveillance that workers found in their workplaces, and that is both sort of technological and managerial, right? So that apps, a tracing mechanism, to stay with the Amazon worker, for example, were extremely sort of pervasive technologies of surveillance and therefore self-control inside of the workplace, to such an extent that the Amazon worker, for example, ended his piece by talking about the fact that if unions wanted to unionize, they needed to stop coming to the kind of warehouses themselves and actually try to meet workers where they were picked up by the buses towards the warehouses, for example. But also the kind of managerial techniques outside of kind of technology, in which workers are sort of monitored, evaluated, and pitted against each other on a sort of daily basis by managerial practices. And finally, was the challenges that both of these processes raised for organizing, and the different ways in which our contributors did or did not manage to sort of overcome these or find ways to overcome them. And that's part of the story as well of these kind of 12 different contributions, is that they certainly don't all lead to effective kind of unionization campaigns, and that there's lots of challenges that are ongoing. The afterlife of the publication has been different in some cases. So, for example, there's a group of workers that wrote a collective contribution, bar workers in South London, who used the publication to then meet with others, read it together, have discussions, and kind of think through how they could kind of bring the work that they were doing forward on the basis of the publication. That's obviously the sort of the dream scenario. It's less clear that it has had that outcome for every single one of our contributors. In fact, no, there's another contributor who was an editor in the newspaper industry, who also used it, went back to his workplace with it, kind of distributed it, and used it as a basis to talk with his co-workers about trying to get their workplace organized. So that's sort of the prehistory of the class composition project. There's two things to say about that. One is that we ended up with quite individual contributions rather than collective ones, which obviously limited their generalizability, if that's a word. And also the project was sort of interrupted by COVID, and we only had first sort of senses of how COVID might impact people in the workplace, without that quite being sort of fully developed yet. So the idea of the class composition project emerged out of From the Workplace, and the hope was to take that same logic. How do we make sense of the transformations and the challenges faced by workers in the workplace in Britain today on a larger scale over a longer period of time? We therefore launched the class composition project in January, and tried to make it as open as possible. We met monthly in meetings that were sort of welcome for everybody who wanted to attend. We opened a forum for discussion, and perhaps the two most important and effective ways in which we reached out was by setting up a survey that we circulated and that is still circulating. Jamie will post the link in the chat for people to be able to open it and circulate it. I haven't asked Jamie beforehand, which is why I'm smiling, because I'm sort of putting him on the spot, but I'm sure he'll do it. And so we gathered close to 300 responses to the survey so far. So the results you will see today are based on the 251st ones that have come in, but the survey is still open, and so you please do circulate it, and if you haven't filled it out yourself, please fill it out. On that basis, we also encourage people to indicate whether they would be prepared to carry out longer sort of detailed interviews with us, which about 30 workers have done so far, and again, obviously, because we still have people coming in, hopefully we'll be able to do more. And those are the kind of the two elements that Lorenza and Jamie will focus on. And perhaps the last thing to say is that in a number of sectors, education, healthcare, IT work, there's a fourth one that I'm not thinking of right now, the sort of working groups of people who work in those sectors sort of were set up to kind of turn the analysis beyond the kind of the macro stuff into more detailed analysis about sectors. And that's sort of the longer term vision of the project, is how to keep allowing us to do that, to kind of zoom in on different sectors, and move beyond the kind of the broad scale analysis to things that are more directly involving workers in those different industries, and hopefully relevant and useful for them. So that's the project overall. And I will now hand over to Lorenza, who will give you a sense of some of the themes and outcomes of the survey we have received so far. So Lorenza, the floor is all yours. Oh, and I should just say, sorry, I've forgotten. Lorenza is currently in South Africa, where power cuts have been announced for this evening. No doubt an attempt by the South African state to undermine today's revolutionary panel. But so hopefully Lorenza should be fine, at least for the first hour together. But if she disappears, that's what's going on. Lorenza, the floor's all yours.
Okay, I'll share my screen too. You see me? You hear me? Screen is fine. So, okay. Thanks, Sai, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. I don't have a sense on who's watching us, but thank you anyways. So what I will do, building on what Sai said, first of all, is to introduce this questionnaire survey as a tool that we chose, and then give you a summary of the first findings that, as Sai said, are preliminary in a sense that as the survey is still open, they might be complemented by the last responses we received in the last few weeks. Just to say that, again, building on what Sai said, that the idea behind the class composition project, as I was saying, was to go beyond the sort of deep dives into some specific sectors that we had from the workplace project, and to have a broader map of the working class Britain. Also a broader map, but also some comparable data that could give us a sense of commonalities, common trends across different sectors, across different regions. Also including a sort of analysis of working conditions before, during, and after COVID. Because of course we started this in the peak of COVID, then there were some periods of relaxation, then now we are continuing, and we get answers from people that have retrieved their working tasks, that went back to work, and that when they are available for interviews, they also give us a sense of how their workplace has changed after COVID. So overall, this survey, as we collectively designed it, aimed at grasping sort of demographics of the people who responded, working conditions in their workplace, if there were major issues, if they were part of a union or not, if there was a union in the workplace, and broadly, if there were major changes in their workplace during COVID. The interviews that we took and that Jamie will talk about try to also elaborate on the survey and give you a post, if we can call it like that, post-COVID scenario. So I'll give you a summary of these are the demographics. Of course, as we know, there's always a bias in a sense that this is a sample of responses that we got that was certainly affected by the outreach of notes from below and of us as individuals in certain sectors in particular, but also, of course, of the circumstances in which we operated during COVID. So certain sectors, certain individuals were more reachable than others through an online survey. Overall, what we got was, in terms of age, as you can see, dominant group in between 25 34 dominant groups in terms of earnings below £30,000 a year, more or less balanced percentage of respondents in terms of gender, a majority of responses from people covering non-managerial roles, and in terms of ethnicity, large dominance of white respondents, with second groups amongst Asian British or mixed, but again. Per region, this is just to give you some graphical representations. This is the distribution of respondents per region and in terms of size of their workplace. So there is a majority of people that responded from workplaces having more than 250 workers. This is the distribution per sector. As you can see, I can't see myself, but majority of people coming from public administration, education, health, and IT. This also corresponds to the sectors where we later managed to form proper working groups that continue to work on this project per sector based. In terms of unionization organization, out of our sample, there is a 55% of people that belong to a union, and 77% of respondents that say that even if they're not part of a union, there are union members in their workplace. Again, this might be a bias also of who we reach, as notes from below. But does obviously not correspond to a UK-wide picture, but to our sample. Interesting trends in terms of working patterns. Only, again, these preliminary findings report to 250 responses. Only 58 people out of the total number of respondents work on a regular Monday to Friday 9 to 5 working pattern, which is only less than 1/4. Of all the responses we got, there is an impressive number, 31 different patterns in terms of different working days. So people that say that they work the same days every week, but out of these, the patterns are 31 different patterns. And in terms of working hours, also people that say they work the same number of hours each day gave patterns that give a picture of 59 different hour patterns. So there's large variability in terms of non-regular working shifts. Again, 1/4 of people that declare not to work on the work variable hours. What emerges in terms of main points of interest, there is more and more, this can be combined to also broader trends that have been observed also in different countries, in different sectors, but the large evidence of divergence in terms from usual working hours. It would be interesting to continue analyze what is the impact of this in terms of family, community life, especially during COVID. We don't have a complete picture, but the disruptions have certainly been very high. Strong expectations. What I didn't say, these responses correspond to answers to both open-ended questions and the multiple choices. So some of these responses are extracted from open-ended kind of questions. Frequent expectations of unpaid overtime, including at the weekends, also occasionally, so on a short-term call, last-minute call. Overall prevalence of flexible working patterns across the board. Then we asked if there were outsourced or agency workers in their workplace. About 50% of our respondents said yes, and yes, 68% of these said that they were treated differently. The most common areas of difference are pay, lack of access to benefits, worse treatment also, especially by managers and supervisors, high levels of precarity, 0 hours very frequent in the UK, lack of job security. Some of the less common ways in which respondents said outsourced and agency workers are treated different, less or no access to resources and equipment, especially during the pandemic, in terms of safety equipment, for example, less like lower trust by managers and colleagues, no unions, sometimes because they are not invited to staff meetings, and sometimes they're not eligible for training and progression. So this is the set of some of the questions that we asked about what kind of changes, what was the working situation during COVID. Of course, we asked whether the respondents were working from home, if the situation improved or worsened during COVID compared to the working situation before, and whether the respondents were put in place of being safe during the pandemic, those that were not working from home. Majority of our respondents at that time, to clarify, the survey was open in spring. So of course, the picture that we got from answers given in March or April or May is not the same as now. Still, the survey is still open. Kind of half of the respondents said that they were working more or less the same number of hours, about the same, 50%. So the majority of those that had to go physically go to their workplace were offered equipments. In terms of, we also asked the questions about how they felt mental life balance, mental balance, work-life balance, and this kind of things. Personally, I think that this is a situation that will have to be monitored on the long time. That we got a picture, a temporary picture last year during lockdown, the situation might have been particularly dramatic, but again, many people are still working in different conditions and are now bearing the costs of 2 years of different working conditions that also have an heavy impact. So some of these questions need to be analyzed also in some time again. In terms of COVID at work, safety, these are the pictures. Again, these respond to a situation where the majority of our respondents was working from home, so does not fully grasp the health and safety risks that other workers in other sectors that probably we didn't manage to fully capture had to go through. We also asked if the facing changes in their workplace, there had been cases of refusal of work, protests during COVID. Under 2/5 of the respondents said that either they or their colleagues had refused to do something the management had asked. Some limited case of joint refusals, but also cases of individual refusals, for example, where workers were asked to go to physically join the workplace and they didn't feel safe, but this should be elaborated more. Yeah, about unions, union involvement, again, the majority of our respondents were union members or part of workplace where unions are present. And this is the list of unions active in the workplace of our respondents. We asked those that were not union members or that observed the barriers to union involvement to give comments of what main obstacles are there, why they did not join a union. These were the most frequent responses: too much work, difficult to get involved, hostility or distrust, not finding unions relevant or fighting enough, and workplace characteristics. So this is it. Briefly, I'm almost done. I don't know for how long I talked, but I'm almost done. We asked some questions about the atmosphere in the workplace, the kind of employment, the kind of relations with the employers. There are some responses here to interpret. On the one hand, you will see this is complemented with the following slide. On the one hand, the majority of our respondents agreed on questions that ask whether employers share information with them, whether employers are open and honest about decisions affecting the company, if they're treated with respect, if staff are paid fairly. Majority said yes. Again, this needs to be crossed with the sectors of our respondents. At the same time, here on different questions, always related to the relationship on the workplace, we had a majority of respondents saying that despite overall positive relationships, they felt highly monitored by their employer, that they were worried about being made redundant, therefore signaling insecurity towards the future as well, and that they were not able to have any influence on company decisions. In terms of, I think this is really the end, we asked to describe which were the most common changes during COVID. And the most common responses that we got were changes in terms and conditions of work or contracts, redundancies, pay freezes, pay pressure, changes related to home or flexible working. And from this, we extracted some points of interest that we are also trying to analyze more, not only through interviews and work conducted during working groups, but also planning a continuation of this project. So interesting points emerge about new hires during or straight after COVID, and so how often the contracts given after the furlough or stoppages during COVID were different. Changes in the pension schemes, de-skilling of workers, increasing working hours in the COVID period, more pressure, this emerges across all sectors, more pressure on contract workers and precarious workers, and in some cases, removal of London waiting. Jamie can say this perhaps more with reference to the in-depth stories that we heard through interviews. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. Once I'll stop the screen sharing. And this is it. Sorry if I disappear, as I said. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, Lorenza. I should have said before that the chat is open on the YouTube page where you should be watching us, and so that you are invited to post questions, remarks, etc. in the chat, and I'll communicate them back to both Lorenza and Jamie as they come in. So please feel free to do that already I realize there's a lot sort of being communicated, so do feel free to kind of pose questions as they occur to you. Jamie, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Sai. And of course, if people want to ask Sai questions, we can ensure that he has those fed back to himself as well. So yeah, thank you, Sai and Lorenzo for the introductions that you've given so far. What I want to talk about is a little bit more about the other things that we've been doing with the project beyond the survey. But just to plug the survey a little bit more, we have just exactly 2 weeks left of running the survey. And I've put a link to the survey in the chat, and also a link that has all the different ways you can share it. So sharing it on social media and so on, because we're really quite keen to kind of finish off the survey and get as much as we can from that. But the project was never going to be just a survey, because a survey can give us some insights. It can help to build a network, but it has, of course, many limitations. We did, however, manage to limit our survey questions to less than 100, unlike Marx, who went for 101 when he did his survey. So we've curbed ours slightly from that number. So don't worry, it's very quick to do. But one of the things we've tried to use the survey for is also to say to people, if you'd like to do an interview, or if you'd like to get involved in the project, you can contact us. And so I mentioned earlier that we've set up a number of different groups within the project to kind of focus on what's happening in particular sectors. And these sector groups have been doing interviews. They've been, well, starting to commission short bits of writing from people in the sector, or to look at particular disputes that are happening that relate to their sector. So in particular, we've had a number of comrades involved in a tech workers group. So people who work in the tech industry or the video games industry, who've been trying to understand what's happening in that kind of work. And as part of that, we did some interviews with the Good Lord strikers, and had those featured on Notes from Below. And they've been interviewing people about, well, the impacts of COVID on the tech sector, but also thinking about, new forms of surveillance that are coming in, the new kinds of pressures in the industry, and also how potentially their work goes on to affect people in other sectors. So designing some of the tools and things that are then used elsewhere. The other sector group that we have is healthcare, which has been interviewing workers in the NHS. So of course, COVID, you may not be surprised to hear, has had quite a big impact on healthcare. And in particular, they've been looking into the growth of new kinds of new ways of shifting working patterns, so particularly around bank working. So nurses or healthcare assistants or other kinds of workers who are not given strict shifts and so on, but are kind of increasingly filling in around for demand, and the role of outsourcing. Because of course, people who are in the UK will know there have been a number of outsourced worker strikes in the NHS during COVID and after COVID, particularly cleaners and porters, security guards, and so on. So there's clearly a number of dynamics to unpack within healthcare. And then within the cultural sector, we have some graphic designers, some other kinds of media workers who've been trying to understand what's happening in cultural work. So they've been having meetings and collectively discussing some of the issues that have come up with that kind of work. But what I wanted to do with the rest of my time was to talk a little bit about the group that I'm involved in, and of course, Sai and Lorenzo both also being involved in education, to talk a little bit about how we've tried to think through what doing a collective inquiry beyond the survey means, for a project like this. So one of the things that we have been doing, it won't be a surprise to hear that a left-wing project has been having lots of meetings, but we've been having collective meetings to plan out who we want to interview, to think about some of the disputes that have been happening, particularly around schools. There've been a number of disputes in London recently, but meeting up regularly to discuss some of the issues that are coming out of the broader class composition survey, to start thinking about the implications of these for the education sector. And in particular, we've started to think through what it means to do a collective project like this, or what it means to finish, to some extent, a part of the collective project. So for us, the class composition project was always going to be a big undertaking. Mapping class composition across the UK was never going to be something we could complete within the year or so that we gave ourselves the time to do. But through these sector groups, what we're aiming to do is to produce chapters that map out the key dynamics in these sectors, the kind of most significant changes that have happened or have an implication on the technical composition of this work, or how people respond or can organize in relation to it. So on the 27th of November, we're going to have a collective meeting with the education group, which of course people are very welcome to join, and I can put the link in the chat. But to begin collectively writing up the chapter for the education section of this overall project. And I think this is a nice experiment. Many of us in our work write individually. We may occasionally write with co-authors. Many people involved in this project might not have much experience of writing, but to come together for a workshop, to talk through these ideas, to begin kind of taking notes and kind of collectively building a picture of what's happening. I think for me, as a kind of a development of this project in terms of what co-research means and what doing these kinds of collective projects means in practice. And so it's an experiment of how we can bring together the survey results, the interviews, individual responses from the survey, collective agreements and disagreements we might have about what's happening in education, and to start using that to write a chapter. And what I just want to kind of introduce is a couple of the themes that I think are emerging and are likely to come into being in the education section. And I think, as Lorenza and Sai have kind of both, I think, mentioned in their introductions, there are some stark kind of intergenerational differences in the experience of work that come through in education. And I think, this is kind of obvious in the university sector. We know that the experience of earlier career academics is very, very different to people who've had permanent contracts for a very long time. Different materially in terms of pay, conditions, access to pension and so on, but also very different in terms of the kind of work that they're doing, the kinds of workloads that they're experiencing, and the way that they interact with the university in lots of ways. But that this is also increasingly true in schooling, that for newly qualified teachers or teaching assistants, the experience of working in a school is very different to that of older teachers who may have been teaching in the industry for quite some time. And there is clearly a transformation of schools happening at the moment, particularly with the use of much more substitute teachers, teaching assistants, the kind of increasing de-skilling of teaching as a profession, and outsourcing in various ways. So one of the things that I found quite interesting was speaking to a teacher who's talking about how lots of lesson planning is now being carried out by external organizations, and teachers are having a lot of that role taken away from them, which of course then means they can do more face-to-face teaching. So teaching other people's material to kind of, intensify how much work they can do during the school day. And I think, across education, we can see the implications of COVID-19 quite clearly. I mean, I think there's probably, not a huge amount to say in terms of COVID-19. We are, of course, not physically doing this conference at SOAS and haven't been able to do the last HM conference because we know about the kind of shutdowns that have happened in education. But I think the other thing that is kind of notable that's emerging is people's relationship with their unions. That in education there are, most respondents, most interviewers talk about the union and talk about a relationship with the union in one way or another, but often talk about how disconnected they are from the union and the union structures. And I think, the strike ballot in British universities gives an indication of this, perhaps, of how the union is often seen as something external to the workplace and to the relationships happening at work. So as Lorenza mentioned, we had a lot of respondents saying that they refused to do things at work during COVID, refused managerial decisions, entered into kind of conflicts at work, many of which weren't mediated through the union, but were through groups of workers responding. So I think there's a bit of a question here about the relationship between struggles that emerge over the labor process at work that are clearly happening on a low-level scale across different kinds of educational workplaces, and connecting those to the experience of trade union organizing. And so there's a kind of number of questions that we want to continue picking at, I guess, as we get towards the workshop in November, which is to try and understand how to connect those dynamics of what's changing in education, the increased precaritization, the use of outsourcing, de-skilling, what happens in the kind of post-COVID reorganization of education, to the questions of what successful forms of action and organizing can emerge in the education sector. And I'm particularly keen to do this around schools and further education colleges, because too often when we talk about education, we focus on the university as a kind of particularly visible workplace. But clearly there's been much happening amongst, school education, kind of post-16 education, further education, that are changing people's experience of work. And I also think if we're trying to understand class composition, the experience that many young people have going through school, going through further education colleges, going through higher education, has an important impact on how they relate to work after universities. So thinking about the different experiences that students have, whether in school or higher education, is an important part of building that picture of how class composition is changing in the UK more widely. But I guess what I want to finish on is just to stress that what we've presented so far today is, I mean, of course, both Sai and Lorenza's presentations are excellent, but we don't want this to be a project that is just presented by the three of us or by other people involved in the project. And if you have ideas or contributions or criticisms or different things that you'd like to bring to it, we're still very working towards conclusions for the project, and it would be fantastic to have more people get involved to shape the project in one way or another. And of course, if you haven't filled out the survey, please do fill out the survey and share it. But if you want to get more involved, we'd be very, very happy to have you involved. Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks to both of you for being very disciplined contributors, leaving us plenty of time for questions and contributions. So in the chat, Roberto asked of whether there was any data related to access and or refusal of furlough, particularly. Maybe I can just answer that, given it's so no, is the short answer. The question was more general about whether employers, whether workers felt protected and or whether workers were had particular changes to their work patterns, pay, etc. I mean, one of the things that I personally find very striking and that also doesn't really come out then in the interviews we did is that despite the fact that we had many people or the bigger groups of contributors being in education and healthcare, that the overwhelming responses was that people felt that they had been taken care of and kept safe throughout the pandemic, which I don't have a clever analysis of. I have to be honest about. But that was quite surprising, certainly in terms of these responses, and they would have sort of assumed that the opposite was true. But so we didn't ask about furlough specifically, we asked about what had happened in response to COVID. I don't know if either Jamie or Lorenzo want to say anything about furlough and COVID, and also just to remind people to put questions, contributions in the chat so that I can pass them on.
Yeah, no, just one point to add is something that I already mentioned, is that I think this matter of health and safety and exposure to risk is just a reflection of the kind of sectors that compose the majority of our respondents that were not the most exposed. So this corresponds to the fact that the highest number of respondents could work from home most of the time. Of course, given the time and the situation which we did this survey, reaching all those sectors, so the essential workers, the most exposed, was and still is more difficult. So if now that, for example, public gatherings or being out is easier, we can find other tools, we can still add more to this picture. We have discussed this. This is an ongoing work. I think the picture that we presented corresponds to the picture during the peak of the pandemic.
Jamie, was that you indicating you wanted to say something, or is that a thinking finger?
Yeah, I think there's a kind of I don't think it's come out particularly in the survey as both of you have said, but I think there have been a couple of interviews about the issue of furlough, and I think furlough has had a kind of, there's been a complicated effect that I think furlough has had for many workers. I think the first is, I think that, there are a number of people that we have interviewed who were furloughed who thought it was the most wonderful experience that they could have imagined during the pandemic, of getting to, getting paid to not work and spend time on other projects and so on. But I think the other experience is of a lot of people who, and this is something that comes up in some of the data, is this sense that in some workplaces where people could have been furloughed and the employer just didn't want to do it, even if it would have had no real cost to them, but they just didn't want to do it because they don't care for people who work for them. A real kind of sense of how callous some employers could be to simply not allow people to be furloughed, which could have put them at less risk of catching COVID and could have meant they could have had that paid time at home. And that because there was no legal requirement around furlough, that it was quite difficult to force furlough happening. So I know particularly with some cleaning companies and so on, they were incredibly reluctant to use furlough. So yeah, I see Roberto's question about this. So yeah, I mean, I think yeah, many managers refuse to, even if they could have had that public subsidy to do so, is there was a kind of sense of, these workers don't deserve to be at home. Why would I furlough, low paid precarious workers? They can just go out and get another job somewhere else, or we'll lay them off, or whatever it is. So I think there was a real callousness that came out, along with that sense of some people who asked for furlough and were just not given it. We're just not given it. But yeah, I don't know, Lorenzo, if you wanted to add something.
Maybe for our listeners who are not in the chat, let me just, so Roberto sort of put a follow-up comment in the chat. This seemed to me a very peculiar feature of the COVID period, managers becoming administrators of public subsidy. It makes sense that workers would have a favorable impression of employers if they were paying wages while people were at home, but obviously not all managers did in fact furlough their workers. And then maybe before I bring Lorenza in, there's also a question by Paul. To what extent does this research show new or increased forms of exploitation? And to what extent is this more a case of forms of historical exploitation being rendered more visible by the pandemic? Thanks for both of those to Roberto and Paul. Lorenza?
So on the first, like the comment by Roberto about this is very interesting. I hadn't reflected on it, but in fact, I mean, if these answers about positive working relationship with the employer were given in the first phase of the pandemic, where workers just compared the previous working patterns and all the stress related to go and physically to work and perhaps receive the same wage. I'm not saying about furlough in particular, could also find this preferable. You remember that the polls at the beginning of the pandemic were in favor of home working. So the assessment of home working and the flexibility related to home working has changed over time. For example, also the extent of mental related issues has increased over time because the flexibility has been replaced by long-term depression because of isolation, of lack of contacts with the others, differing relationship with the union, as Jamie was saying, and so on and so forth. So interesting that this was kind of expectable in the first phase of the pandemic. Thank you, Roberto, I'm reading through Sai. I can't engage directly with you, but thank you for all the interesting questions and comments. The second, about whether these are new forms of exploitation or these have been rendered more visible by the pandemic. I mean, there are some trends. I mean, we can all answer on this. I don't have one specific answer to this. This is a question, and the analysis of the weight of the pandemic on the changing world of work is something that's a huge debate that we're all having. I think some mechanisms where there are like part of historical trends, but the COVID pandemic has also suggested new ways of exploitation, of new possible ways to isolate workers that before were not there. And the problem is not whether these were old or new. The problem is whether these will continue after COVID, and if we will have lost some spaces and some opportunities for organizing on a permanent way. So I don't have one specific answer, but I'm especially concerned by the long-term effects of what seem to be temporary.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add to that, thanks Lorenza, and thanks Paul and Roberto for the questions and the remarks. It seems to me that both things are going on, right? So on the one hand, I think the sort of maybe obvious outcome is that the experience of the pandemic is massively shaped by all sorts of existing inequalities well before well before the emergence of the pandemic, and that the ways in which workers were or were not able to work from home, for example, right? So the debate about working from home itself is already shaped by the particular experience of largely white-collar office workers who were able simply to work from far away, and then the comfort in which that was or not possible to be done. In fact, we already had some of those kind of responses in from the workplace. One worker worked in a call center for Netflix and describes the way in which the call center gets brought in the home, right? Which is obviously quite a different experience of working from home than, you know, let's say fairly comfortable university professors might have had, or even within the university, you know, the different experiences of people on short-term contracts or people on long-term contracts, etc., compared to then, you know, I don't know, the delivery workers who continue to bring food and shopping and groceries and whatever else to people's door while they worked at home, or, you know, construction workers. Massive question in the UK of construction workers continuing to kind of work in these very kind of crowded and collective ways. So in that sense, of course, the pandemic has been shaped, the response to the pandemic and the experience been shaped by existing inequalities in the labor market. But I also think that what we're seeing, and in fact, I've put it in the chat for people to look at, we published two kind of initial findings and further steps papers, one for the project in general and one for education, also calling for individual contributions. So if you're listening to this and you'd like to share, either in short form or long form, some of your experiences of work, either linked to the pandemic or not, please do so. And if you'd just like to chat about it before you make the decision, please get in touch as well. And we'd be very happy to have one of our editors kind of chat things through with you. But is that there also appears to be an employer's offensive that sort of emerges out of the pandemic in a number of different ways. I think the most visible way in which that has happened is a number of experiences of fire and rehire, one of which Jamie talked about that we covered. But obviously, which has been a wider question that kind of unions have been trying to deal with, and it's quite a naked assault on working conditions and trying to use the kind of disorganization, isolation, etc., that might have emerged out of COVID in that way. There's also employers that are already announcing that workers will never return back to offices, right? Most kind of visibly and publicly was Twitter, but they're certainly not the only ones. The discovery that actually having a number of workers alone in their home rather than having a sort of weekly ability to come together, a daily ability to come together and sort of collectivize work experiences is obviously also an important one. I mean, I know in my own workplace, you know, trying to organize against casualization, just not knowing that there's lots of new colleagues that we've just never met, never seen, don't know that they exist, etc. And obviously like attempts at making that last for a longer period. And so that it also appears that there's a number of ways in which there are new responses that emerge out of the pandemic, but also that are being dragged on post-pandemic. And so, I mean, you know, people working in universities in the UK will be particularly aware of the fact that there's a whole number of disputes around shutting down courses, reorganizing universities. I mean, there was this brilliant victory in Liverpool, but then there was also much less positive experiences in Leicester, for example, where an entire program got shut down. So also clearly where the kind of the disorganization of the pandemic is used, particularly in the post-92 universities, to kind of drive through quite important restructuring that do appear to kind of come together as a general trend of an employer's offensive coming out of it. Lorenza.
Yeah, just remembered some other responses that we got, always on changes in the workplace. So one frequent trend was for companies to cut costs, companies relocating from London to outside of London to reduce rents. And this also affected the composition of the working teams. Second frequent response, companies that downsized the office spaces to still reduce costs and therefore exploited these hybrid patterns that before were allowed but not official, of workers working 3 days from the office, these also in service, for example, 3 days from home, from the office and 2 days from home, making this compulsory, so that 1 or 2 days a week you need to work from home, and they have a rota in the office so that they can use shared workspaces. And this means also that less and less workers can meet at the same time in the workspace. So these things are becoming more and more frequent.
Thanks, Lorenza. Jamie, did you want to come back to anything? We've also had a new question from Panagiotis, who asks, are there any signs that a part of the employer's offensive, we are also witnessing attempts towards institutional changes for the worse in labor law, for example?
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things to add to this. I mean, I think the employer's offensive is uneven, and I think is happening in different ways in different sectors. I do think there are a number of, for example, to respond to what Panagiotis is asking about institutional changes, I think there is a continuation of a longer term trend of kind of hardening of labor law against workers. I mean, I think, you know, one of the most significant ones of these, I think, if we, you know, looking at the UCU ballot as it's kind of still fresh in my mind, is the continuing restrictions in the UK on trade union activity. And I think particularly the recent attempt to limit protest in the UK would have had very, very significant effects on how you can behave on a picket line. And in particular would have limited protests that seek to cause economic disruption, which if your picket line is not seeking to cause economic disruption, it's probably not going to be a very good picket line. So I think there is a kind of higher level attempt by the Conservative Party to introduce further limitations from an institutional side on how workers can organize and respond to these things. But I think the reality is, for most workers who are not having that kind of relationship with the union, who are not having to deal with balloting processes or so on, these can feel somewhat removed in most sectors, I guess. And so I think this kind of goes back a little bit to Paul's question too, right? Of like, what is particularly new about what's happened during COVID? And I think there are elements of new management practices emerging in some sectors. So particularly through the use of technology for scheduling systems or electronic surveillance. As an example, there was a statistic I found the other day that sales of surveillance software to employers went up by 97% during the pandemic. And I think if employers are able to get away with using some of these new techniques during the pandemic, they're not going to stop using them once the lockdown ends. But are these novel shifts? Well, for most workers, there is an experience of intense surveillance and supervision already. So this isn't as such a kind of new thing happening, just it's a new iteration of a broader trend, if that makes sense. But I don't know, Lorenzo, if that was a hand from you. Oh, okay.
I see no new questions and or comments in the chat. So if you still had one and you were sort of hesitating to ask it, now is your moment. You know, of course, you can get in touch with notes from below, and we'd be happy to you know, continue the discussions later on. I'll just give you a number of reminders while you think about whether you still have questions, and then I'll go around to maybe closing remarks and or responses if there are further questions. Zanti is still typing, so then I'll definitely do the reminders so I get the question. So a number of reminders. First of all, the project is still running, so please fill in the survey if you haven't already, circulate it if you to your contacts. And if you'd like to participate in any way through short contributions by participating in some of the open discussions that we're organizing by writing a longer contribution, please do so. You can go on the Notes from Below website. You'll find again in the chat on YouTube the link both for education workers in particular, which we assume are most of the people logged in here, but also for the project as a whole. And so please don't hesitate also to be in touch if you're thinking about maybe a contribution that you'd like to make and you're not sure. If you'd like to have a sense of work we've done before, you can go on the website and you can also order, I have to stand behind it, from the workplace, which you can order for free if you prefer to have it as a hard copy. You can also download it on YouTube and in fact on the website. And in fact, if you look down to the left of Jamie's screen, you can see a new batch of from the workplace books that have just been ordered. So they're waiting for you to ask for them. In terms of HM, let me also remind you that the journal and the conference is only possible because of the journal, and we depend on the subscriptions to the journal. So please subscribe if you haven't already, and you can do so at a discounted price for the duration of the conference. And you can do that on the HM website. And similarly, Haymarket Books, which are very kindly hosting this session, has a 40% discount on the HM book series that you can order. Now, before I bring everybody in for concluding remarks, let me also bring in our last kind of comment or question that everybody can maybe also kind of come back to. So Zanti says, you identify through your research a range of factors emerging from and exacerbated by COVID, which make work more isolated, make it more difficult to organize and degrade and intensify work. I agree that employees are on the offensive in some places, sectors, and that this is uneven. I wonder whether the inquiry has identified areas where employees are challenged and there might be weaknesses that workers can exploit. Very important question, I think. And then Roberto also puts in another comment. Redundancy processes is an area where innovations in managerial practices and labor law is occurring. Swift and large-scale redundancies have required new administrative technologies. I'll just copy and paste those into the chat as well, so that both Jamie and Lorenza can look at them. There you go. So you guys can see them also now. Shall we take it maybe in the same order? So maybe I can say a couple of things in terms of this question. I mean, I think the question of unevenness is important because it's not because there is an offensive that is trying to kind of build on existing patterns of isolation that an offensive is necessarily successful, right? And so, I mean, to stick with the kind of the case of education that we've been talking about, education has both been clearly an area of intensified assault and an area of intensified resistance, right? I mean, throughout the pandemic, the only actual political opposition that appears to have existed in the UK came from the General Secretary of the NUT. Well, not the, sorry, they're called the, I've forgotten it now, NU, New Education Union. And very hard kind of resistance. Now, as far as I can tell, largely from above, but nonetheless, a kind of a really important sort of marker in terms of fighting back against very poor government policy. Although I know Panagiotis is in the chat, so maybe now he'll be furiously commenting about that. At the same time, what we're seeing in higher education is the fact that clearly resistance is ongoing, right? The kind of the victory in Liverpool is a very impressive one. I think not only for activists in higher education, right? The fact that a union not only was able to take on redundancies and win, but was able to do so on such a hard basis, right? Like we're not going back until all the kind of redundancies are cancelled, I think is an extremely inspiring and important kind of signal to be sent across the labor movement, that it's both possible to do it and necessary, and hopefully can sort of serve also as a motivator in the ongoing votes for strike action in the sector. And in fact, the recent ballot, I have to say, I think is a pretty interesting kind of outcome, right? I mean, you kind of think that with the reballots and things like that, it looks like we're going into big confrontations, certainly in the new term in higher education. So that's one thing. On the one hand, there's clearly lots of signs of workers still fighting back. The good Lord workers that Jamie mentioned, of course, were another of these examples. The fact that rank and file construction workers were able to, for a second time, wage a successful dispute against the kind of the large construction firms. Clearly, there's also kind of an ongoing rebuilding in the labor movement. And, you know, for example, the election in Unite seems to point also to the fact that there's an appetite for kind of serious industrial action rather than the kind of abstract political leadership of the McCluskey era. And then just one more thing is that also there appeared to be kind of more structural contradictions that employees are having to deal with. The question of job, sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? Lack of people to fill jobs. I'm having a foreign moment, can't remember how to say it.
Labor shortage.
Labor shortage, thank you so much. Everything is going well. Labor shortages also point to kind of, you know, for truck drivers throughout the pandemic in the food industry. I mean, clearly there's questions of kind of fundamental contradictions that are a problem for employers, and that will at least in theory, reinforce the hand of labor in kind of negotiations and abilities to organize, if that organization does happen, right? That's obviously the question of whether there is a push from below to kind of deal with some of that stuff. I'll shut up now and pass on to Lorenza.
Thanks, Sai. Thanks, Xanti, for your question and comment. It's nice to know that you're in the audience, even though I can't see you. I would be happy to see you. So one issue, one answer about whether the inquiry has identified areas where workers can challenge employers. Personally, I think, as we said, this is an ongoing project that went through different phases. I think the survey per se gave a picture during COVID of like all the implications related to isolation. And it was important that even workers could reflect on this, because as usual, when you are isolated, you think that all your problems are in your head sometimes, but it's important to know, to disclose and to shed light on how many people feel the same, and on the mechanisms of exploitation that were used during the pandemic. But at the same time, the picture that emerged in the months of the survey was also a period of low political motivations and low political activity. What we can do, I think, where this project can work is that now that there is a reopening and we are also using other tools with the opportunity to gather, now we can put this into action, whereby what I perceive is that all the tiredness and the anger are now coming through. I mean, I think the message given in higher education in the university sectors through the recent ballots in many universities was a sign. In many sectors, there is a sign that people are so desperate to go and mobilize again because they felt lonely. And they're also tired because, again, there was not only the pandemic, but workers in the UK are now perceiving the effects of Brexit and COVID together. Labor shortages has double motivations. But so now there is an opportunity to support organizing processes. And I mean, with this phase of the project, we will do it. It's not something that we pictured from last season, the first phase of the project, but we will continue doing, I think.
Yeah, a couple of things that I would like to add. I mean, I think perhaps we've tried to emphasize some of the changes that have happened to people's experience of work that have come out through the survey. I certainly think, and I think Zanti's question is very important, is that if we've, the aim of this project isn't just to focus on the employer's offensive. I think what does come out from a lot of the survey data is people describing or explaining things that have happened to their work or how their work has been changed by other people. I think the survey data is probably not where we're going to get the most interesting explanations or uncover the kind of most interesting findings for how people are resisting or how people are organizing, because I think the short form questions are quite difficult to kind of get a sense of kind of what's happening, perhaps. However, I do think one of the things that's quite notable is how many people have been refusing to do things at work. Now, of course, the kinds of people that fill out a notes from below sample are probably the kinds of people who are less likely to listen to their managers at work or whatever it is. But I think there's a kind of interesting sense that even without open struggles, lots of people have engaged in forms of refusal throughout the pandemic. I'm sure many of us have experiences through the pandemic where our managers have told us to do something that we didn't think was safe, and we have, ignored them or went away and did something else. I do think, though, to build back in that picture, this is where the collective writing, this is where commissioning specific pieces is what brings in that other dimension to it. So, for example, with the education group, one of the things that we've been quite keen to do is to reach out to both union and non-union networks of workers in education. So particularly around schools, there are some networks of teachers inside the union. There are a couple outside of the union as well, and talk to them about what they've been doing, what's been successful, what's worked, how they've responded to some of these changes. Because I certainly don't think the story of the pandemic is just one of workers passively accepting things from management or from the state, for example. And I do think it's been harder to, this is a slightly longer running issue, and then I promise I will finish on this, of just the paucity of labour reporting in the UK, that it's very, very difficult to get a sense of what kinds of struggles have been happening during the pandemic, but that the reporting often will report that a strike happened, but won't report what the outcome of the strike was. And so there's a number of other initiatives like Strike Map that have been trying to kind of map out what's been happening. But often what you find is a very unclear picture of whether some of these big strikes during the pandemic or widespread actions have actually resulted in victories for workers, or whether there's been some kind of negotiation that hasn't been so effective. So I do think particularly that's one of the things that we want to commission people who've been involved in some of those struggles to write a short account of, or kind of bring those things up. And I think that's a kind of continuing experimentation with what we've been doing with Notes from Below. That it can't be people from outside reporting on things, that we want to get people reporting on their own experiences and sharing them and learning from them. But I think so far this project has been an interesting experiment with what that looks like in practice. Yeah.
Thank you so much to both Lorenza and Jamie for today's session, to all of you for coming along, for your questions, your comments. Panagiotis has added a comment about the kind of the situation in Greece and the return of struggles and of victories, so people can check that out also. And yes, from Notes from Below and from Historical Materialism, thank you so much for coming along. It's lovely to see comrades even just in the chat, and we look forward to be able to hopefully discuss these things sort of in person with you again next year. In terms of reminders, please subscribe to the journal. Please go to the Haymarket website to get your 40% off on the HM book series. Make sure to check out the calls on notes from below, both if you are a worker in education or if you'd like to make a broader contribution to the project, and make sure to fill in the survey if you haven't, to circulate it. And don't forget that the conference keeps going. So please check out the full timetable on the HM website and make sure to log in for our future sessions for the next just over a week for this year's conference, and hopefully see you all next year in person.
Thank you for your fantastic chairing, Si.
Thank you very much.